Well, to answer this and other issues, we're now joined via Zoom by Dr. Jako, a senior lecturer in strategy and sustainability at the University of Stellenbosch. Dr. Volschenk, a very good evening to you. Thank you so much for joining us. Welcome to the Globe.
Thank you, Simpuya.
You say that nature replenishes what we consume every year, including fish, forests, orchards, and so on. But South Africans have not allowed Earth to recover for more than 50 years. So what would you attribute this to? Could it be the overwhelming population size that essentially slows down the Earth's recovery process?
Well, I think to answer that, you have to understand the concept of Earth Overshoot Day as two variables. On the one side, there's the consumption aspect. On the other side, there's what the Earth produces. South Africa as a country is fairly barren. We don't have that much agriculture compared to a country like Spain or France or Canada even. So that's the one aspect. On the other side, South Africans do not really consume that much, but we just don't have an ecological bank account that produces enough rent for us to use during a year.
Well, do you reckon the many governments then are finding it, incredibly difficult to strike a balance between protecting the environment on the one hand and sustaining livelihoods through pushing the industrial sector, which unfortunately comes at a cost of the environment?
Absolutely. We have a growing population with human rights. Each of those people have the right to food, to work, to a safe place to live. So certainly governments are under immense pressure to do this, and there are ways of overcoming this. But certainly population sizes is one of the primary problems.
Well, it's quite heartwarming to see that you can still turn things around. So how can nature be conserved and used sustainably while simultaneously meeting other global societal goals?
Simpuya, I think if you look back at 2020, during 2020, Earth Overshoot Day was actually a month later during the year. So last year it was around about August. So it showed us that in periods of lesser consumption, we actually can turn this around. So I referred to populations earlier. On the one side, we should in the long run try to stabilize or decrease populations. But certainly on the per capita consumption, we should try to work towards consuming less per capita, but then also adopting practices such as the circular economy or a service economy where we convert the selling of goods to rather converting those goods to services. For instance, instead of a car, selling transport. And that's a slightly more sustainable way in which we can have economic growth and at the same time still have a natural environment that can be conserved.
Now, the current plans for reducing carbon dioxide emissions, relies heavily on bioenergy, which requires a whole lot of land. So with the land scarcity that we see, on a yearly basis, is this an indication perhaps that we're still far off in terms of preserving our environment?
Certainly, I think the solution for South Africa, is not in bioenergy. In fact, I think we have shown that we've got plenty of wind resources. We've got some of the best solar resources in the world. So I think those are the two big ones that we can look towards. There are many other forms of energy that show very encouraging forms of progress. There's concentrated solar power. One of the problems with renewable energy, for instance, is the fact that you don't always have energy when you need it, whereas CSP or concentrated solar power can actually provide you with that. And then there are also other forms of energy, like wave energy, for instance, that can certainly in the longer run provide us with quite a bit of energy. So I wouldn't say that we need to consume the same nature that we eat from to also consume that for the energy use that we require. I think if we want to move Earth Overshoot Day later in the year, we should look towards practices such as eating less meat and maybe going for a more flexitarian diet, as they call it, and also traveling less for work purposes. And this again coming back to COVID, it's shown great progress with people traveling less for work. That our emissions come down, but at the same time also we don't want to discourage tourism. because that's one of the big sources of happiness, of contentment of people, and at the same time it gives us a good kind of economic growth.
And I understand the bioenergy push is causing a whole lot of harm, because in some countries where there are rainforests, some of these rainforests are being cut down to give way to grow palm oil for the manufacturing of biodiesel. Isn't biodiesel a better alternative?
In fact, I think, most of the forests that are disappearing, and we can think about the Amazon, for instance, it's mostly for soy. You mentioned palm oil, also for cattle growing, so it's meat. Palm oil, in fact, is the biggest use of palm oil is in things like chocolate that we consume or making cookies crisp. So we find palm oil almost everywhere, but the conundrum that we face really is if you need to produce oil for some purpose, palm oil is probably one of the easiest ways and the cheapest ways and one of the most efficient ways of producing oil. So we really face a problem in saying, if we want to scale down something, palm oil is a big place where we should start, but it's certainly not the solution, because if we replace palm oil with something else, it's likely that other thing is as bad. We should much rather look at practices such as voluntary simplicity, where we say, let's scale down our consumption voluntarily. We do not need to buy a car every 3 years. We do not need to buy a huge house and then have to put in extra hours at work and sometimes not even enjoying the work that we do just in order to afford that car or afford the house. So voluntary simplicity is moving more towards spending your money on things that give you real value, on also spending more time with your friends, with your family, and those are things which we know brings mental health and happiness in the longer run.
So how then do we tackle climate change that will help biodiversity?
Well, with climate change, I think, if we want to solve that problem as they say, two birds with one stone, planting trees is a great way to start. Planting indigenous trees. Those are ways in which we increase biodiversity, we increase the habitat of birds, of insects, of animals, and at the same time, those act as sinks for the environment. We're seeing incredible heat waves in the northern hemisphere currently. What we should try to avoid is the tipping point. It's where trees start dying because of climate change, and once they start dying, they emit carbon emissions or methane emissions, which are even much worse, and those causes even more climate change. So it's almost like a runaway train downhill. And that's what we really should be trying to avoid. And that's not directly what Earth Overshoot Day speaks to, but it's certainly one of the big challenges that we face, is turning climate change around.
Would I be too ambitious to make a suggestion that we need to call on the wealthy people to consume less?
You're spot on. I think if we see where we can have the biggest levers to pull, it is on the higher income side. It is on the side of, as I mentioned earlier, per capita consumption. South Africa, for instance, if I just use our country as an example, we've got the most unequal society in the world. Our Gini coefficient is the highest in the world, which means that a very, very small, very rich component of our country, and if I would say, listeners or viewers of this TV show probably count in the 1% of the highest earning people in the country. And it's actually us that have the biggest impact. It's us that replace our cars very regularly, that spend things on many clothes that we don't actually require, all of those things. So certainly it's not the poor that we should be looking towards, it's the rich that we should be looking at. When I spoke about voluntary simplicity earlier, I'm certainly not professing voluntary poverty. I think we have a duty to have a more equal society of uplifting the poor. They should have access to the same luxuries as the rich, but it means that the truth is somewhere in the middle. If we took the poorest countries in the world and the richest countries in the world and this straight line, and we said, where is that line where we can survive with one earth? It would probably end with a lifestyle equal to Pakistan, which we can agree is not a fantastic lifestyle, but that's the one for our current population and living standards that we can actually sustain. Which goes back to the point that in the long run, if we want a higher quality of living than that, we need to start also looking at population growth as a way to solve this problem.
And I suppose solving this problem would also need the buy-in from the various governments worldwide. So what then do we do in terms of coercing those governments which still haven't ascribed to the protocols or the climate change protocols? And those that have, how do we ensure that they abide by those protocols?
I think we can make changes through our votes. I think that's one of the slower ways of doing it. I think your point of governments being the easiest way of changing it, I think our work at a business school, we profess the fact that it's business that can make the biggest changes. There are businesses with the turnover equal to most countries or higher than most countries. So if we look towards companies, we can't always blame companies because we buy from these companies. We as consumers determine what gets produced. So it's up to us to say, no, we want more sustainable products. We want more of this or we want more of that. But if you do want to take it to the government level, it must come from the voters. A government or a company, or for that matter, they don't have souls. It's people that have souls. We have to be the conscience of society, and without us, each of us playing our role, it's never going to change. We can't expect the big leaders because the big leaders still take the cue from us.
All right, Dr. Volschenk, great chatting to you. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Simpiwe.
That is Dr. Jako Volschenk, a senior lecturer in strategy and sustainability at the University of Stellenbosch Business School.